Few realizations feel as unsettling as this one. The version of you that you've been trying to reach does not exist, not because growth is meaningless, but because growth does not end in the way you once imagined. At some point in your development, there was likely a quiet belief guiding your effort, not always consciously, but present. The belief that one day things would settle completely, that one day you would be fully stable, fully aware, fully integrated. Carl Jung understood this impulse deeply. He observed that the ego naturally seeks completion. It wants resolution, finality, a sense that the work is finished. And in the early stages of growth, this belief is almost necessary. It gives direction. It creates motivation. It allows you to move forward through uncertainty. You begin to work on yourself. You reflect. You confront your patterns. You integrate parts of your shadow. And gradually you change. You become less reactive, more stable, more aware of your internal processes. And with each step, the idea of arrival feels closer. You may not say it explicitly, but you feel it. I'm getting there. There's a version of me I'm moving toward. A final state where things will be clear. But if the process continues, if you go far enough into your own psyche, something unexpected begins to happen. That sense of arrival starts to dissolve. Not suddenly, but gradually. You begin to notice that every layer you integrate reveals another layer beneath it. Every pattern you understand exposes a deeper complexity. Every moment of clarity is followed by a new kind of question. Carl Jung described this as the expanding relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The more conscious you become, the more you realize how much remains unconscious. And this realization changes the direction of growth entirely. Because now, you are no longer moving toward completion. You are moving into depth. Let's make this concrete. Earlier in your journey, emotional reactivity may have been your primary challenge. You would get triggered. You would react quickly. You would feel overwhelmed by certain situations. And through awareness, you began to change that. You learned to pause, to observe, to respond more intentionally. And eventually, that instability reduced. At that stage, it might have felt like you were solving something, like you were moving toward a more stable version of yourself. But then something new appears. You notice subtler reactions, not explosive, but present, more refined, less obvious. You begin to see that the work did not end. It simply changed form. Carl Jung warned that the unconscious does not disappear when it becomes conscious. It reorganizes. It evolves. It expresses itself differently, which means there is no final version of you that is completely free from unconscious influence. There is only increasing awareness of it. Now consider something even deeper, your identity itself. Earlier, growth may have been about becoming someone more confident, more aware, more stable, more integrated. But over time, even that begins to shift. You realize that every identity you form eventually becomes incomplete. Carl Jung emphasized that the ego can never fully contain the self. The self is larger, more complex, more dynamic, which means any fixed idea of who you are will always be partial. And this creates a subtle tension. Because the ego still wants something stable to hold on to, it still wants a definition, a final form. But the deeper you go into individuation, the less stable those definitions become. You begin to feel something that is difficult to describe at first, a kind of openness, but also a kind of groundlessness. You are no longer fixed in the same way. You are not who you used to be, but you are also not a finished version of something new. And this is where many people feel discomfort, because this stage removes the illusion of completion. You begin to see that growth is not leading to a final state. It is leading to an ongoing process. Carl Jung described individuation as a lifelong unfolding, not a goal that can be reached, but a movement that continues as long as consciousness exists. And this idea challenges something very deep in the psyche, the desire to arrive, because arriving means rest, certainty, completion. But what you begin to discover instead is something else entirely, a different kind of stability, not the stability of being finished, but the stability of remaining in process. Let's look at how this appears in everyday life. You handle a situation well. You respond with awareness. You remain grounded. And instead of thinking, I've finally mastered this, you notice something else. There is still more here, not as a problem, not as failure, but as reality. Carl Jung believed that this recognition is a sign of deeper maturity because it reflects a shift away from ego-based growth towards self-oriented development. You are no longer trying to eliminate all unconscious material. You are learning to remain conscious in relation to it. And that is a completely different orientation. It does not aim for perfection. It does not aim for completion. It aims for continuity. You remain aware. You remain engaged. You remain open to what has not yet been seen. And this changes how growth feels. It becomes less dramatic, less goal-oriented, less defined by milestones, and more like a continuous unfolding. You may even begin to notice that the desire to finish fades, not because you have given up, but because you understand something more accurately. There is nothing to finish. Carl Jung repeatedly emphasized that the psyche is inexhaustible, not as a poetic idea, but as a psychological reality. There will always be more to discover, more to integrate, more to understand. And this is not a limitation. It is the nature of being human. But accepting this requires letting go of something important. The belief that one day you will be complete. Because that belief, while motivating at first, eventually becomes an obstacle. It keeps you oriented toward an endpoint that does not exist. And it prevents you from fully entering the process itself. So the shift that begins here is subtle, but fundamental. You stop asking, when will I be done? And you begin asking, how do I remain aware while this continues? Carl Jung would say that this is where individuation truly begins. Not at the moment of insight, but at the moment you accept that insight will never be final. And that acceptance does not create despair. It creates something much more stable. A way of moving forward without needing to arrive. Something important begins to reveal itself when you look closely at why the idea of a final version of yourself feels so compelling. Because the desire to arrive is not random. It is structural. It comes from the nature of the ego itself. Carl Jung observed that the ego is not designed to live in open-ended processes. It seeks orientation. It needs boundaries, definitions, conclusions. Without them, it begins to feel unstable. So naturally, when the ego encounters something as vast and undefined as psychological growth, it tries to organize it into something finite, a path, a progression, a destination, and most importantly, an ending. You may notice this pattern if you reflect honestly. At some point, you likely imagine a version of yourself where things would finally settle, where your reactions would be fully under control, where your emotions would be completely understood, where your identity would feel solid and resolved. Carl Jung understood this impulse deeply. He noted that the ego constantly attempts to create a sense of totality, even when that totality does not exist. Because without that sense, it feels exposed, uncertain, unfinished. And the ego does not tolerate unfinished easily. So it creates an image, a future version of you that represents completion, and then it begins moving toward it. This is what gives growth its early structure. You improve, you reflect, you integrate. And with each step, the imagined endpoint feels closer. But here is where the psychological mechanism becomes clearer. The closer you get, the more the endpoint shifts. Because what the ego is trying to reach is not something real. It is a projection. Carl Jung described projection as the act of placing unconscious content onto something external. In this case, onto the idea of a future self. You are not actually moving toward a fixed version of yourself. You are moving through layers of your psyche. And as those layers become conscious, new layers appear, which means the endpoint keeps moving, not because you are failing, but because there is no endpoint to reach. Now, let's go deeper into why this is difficult to accept. Because even when you begin to understand this intellectually, something in you still resists it. There's still a part of you that wants closure, that wants a moment where you can say, this is it, I've done the work. Carl Jung would say that this resistance comes from the ego's need for stability. A fixed identity provides stability. A final state provides stability. An ending provides stability. But the psyche does not operate within fixed structures. It is dynamic, alive, continuously evolving. And this creates a tension between two forces: the ego's need for completion and the psyche's nature as an ongoing process. This tension is not something you solve. It is something you learn to hold, because if you try to resolve it by forcing completion, you create illusion. And if you reject the ego's need entirely, you create fragmentation. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires maintaining balance between these forces. The ego must remain stable enough to function, but flexible enough to adapt. And this is where the idea of a final self becomes dangerous, because it freezes the process. It gives the ego something to hold on to permanently. And once the ego believes it has reached that point, growth stops, not externally, but internally. You may still learn, still experience, still evolve, but the orientation changes. Instead of remaining open, you begin reinforcing what you believe you have already achieved. Carl Jung warned that this is one of the most subtle forms of psychological stagnation, not regression, not collapse, but fixation, the belief that you have arrived. And this belief does something very specific. It reduces curiosity. You stop asking deeper questions. You stop looking for what remains unconscious. You stop challenging your own understanding. Because why would you, if you believe the process is complete? This is why Jung emphasized that consciousness must remain in relationship with the unknown, because the unknown is what keeps the psyche alive. And the moment you remove the unknown, you reduce the psyche to something static, which it is not. Now, let's bring this into a real situation. You go through a period of growth. You become more stable, more aware, more integrated, and you begin to feel a sense of completion. Not fully, but enough to relax, to settle, to believe that the major work is behind you. And then something unexpected happens. A new reaction appears, a deeper insecurity, a more subtle pattern, something you had not seen before, and it disrupts that sense of completion. At first, this can feel frustrating, even discouraging, because it contradicts the idea that you were done. But Carl Jung would interpret this differently. He would say, this is not regression. This is expansion. What you are encountering is not failure, but a deeper layer becoming visible, because awareness does not eliminate the unconscious. It expands into it, and every expansion reveals more. This is why growth feels endless, not because it is repetitive, but because it is layered. Each stage reveals something new, not the same problem again, but a more refined version of it, a deeper expression, a subtler form. Carl Jung believed that this is the natural rhythm of individuation, not linear progression toward a final state, but continuous movement into greater complexity. And once you begin to see this clearly, something shifts in how you relate to growth. You stop expecting closure. You stop looking for a final identity. You stop measuring yourself against an imagined endpoint, and instead, you begin to orient yourself differently, toward awareness itself, not as a destination, but as a way of moving. You are no longer asking, how close am I to being done? You're asking, how present am I within this process? And this shift reduces a significant amount of internal pressure, because the pressure was never coming from growth itself. It was coming from the expectation that growth should end. Carl Jung understood that the psyche cannot be completed, but it can be related to. And that relationship is what individuation actually is. Not becoming something final, but remaining conscious within something infinite. And when this becomes real, not as an idea, but as an experience, the need for an ending begins to dissolve. Not because you force it to, but because you see clearly that it was never possible. And in that clarity, something stabilizes. Not the illusion of completion, but the acceptance of continuation. Something fundamental changes the moment you stop organizing your life around the idea of becoming complete, not because you lose direction, but because direction itself becomes something different. Carl Jung made it clear that individuation is not about reaching a fixed state. It is about maintaining a conscious relationship with psyche that never stops unfolding. And once it becomes real to you, not just understood, but lived, your behavior begins to shift in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. You stop preparing for a future version of yourself and start inhabiting the present one more fully. Earlier in your development, many of your actions may have been oriented toward becoming. You reflected to improve. You observed to evolve. You corrected yourself to get closer to something. Even your awareness had a direction. It was leading somewhere. But now, something loosens. You still reflect. You still observe. You still grow. But the underlying pressure changes. You are no longer doing these things to arrive. You are doing them because they are part of how you live. Carl Jung would describe this as a shift from goal-oriented development to process-oriented consciousness. You are no longer building yourself toward an endpoint. You are participating in an ongoing unfolding. And this changes how you relate to everyday experience. Let's start with something simple. A difficult emotion appears. Frustration, doubt, uncertainty. Earlier, you may have reacted with a kind of urgency. You would try to understand it quickly, resolve it, move past it, because somewhere underneath, there was a belief that these experiences should eventually disappear, that once you were fully developed, they would no longer occur. Now that expectation fades. You feel the emotion without needing to eliminate it. You observe it without turning it into a problem. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological maturity does not remove emotional experience. It changes your relationship to it. You're no longer trying to become someone who doesn't feel certain things. You are someone who can experience them without being defined by them. And this creates a different kind of internal space. Emotions move, but they do not disrupt your orientation. Now, consider something more subtle. Your relationship to your own progress. Earlier, you may have tracked it, measured it, compared where you are now to where you used to be. There was a narrative, a sense of movement toward something. Now, that narrative becomes less important, not because growth has stopped, but because it no longer needs to be monitored in the same way. Carl Jung believed that when individuation deepens, the ego becomes less concerned with tracking development and more aligned with experiencing it. You no longer need to constantly evaluate yourself. You trust the process enough to remain inside it. And this removes a quiet but persistent tension, the tension of self-measurement. You are no longer asking, am I progressing fast enough? Am I where I should be? Am I becoming who I'm supposed to be? Because those questions depend on a fixed endpoint. And once that endpoint dissolves, the questions lose their foundation. You begin to live without needing those answers. Now let's look at something even more revealing. Setbacks. Moments where you feel like you've moved backward. You react in a way you thought you had outgrown. You fall into a familiar pattern. Earlier, this might have felt like failure, like you were losing progress, like something had gone wrong. Now, the interpretation shifts. You still notice it, but you do not frame it as regression. Carl Jung would say that what appears as regression is often the emergence of previously unconscious material, something deeper becoming visible. And when you understand this, your response changes. You do not panic. You do not overcorrect. You remain with it. You observe it. You allow it to show you what has not yet been integrated. And this is where growth becomes more continuous. Not because there are no disruptions, but because disruptions no longer break your orientation. You remain within the process, even when it becomes uncomfortable. Now, consider your relationship to identity itself. Earlier, identity may have felt like something you were building, defining, refining. You were becoming someone. But over time, that structure softens. You realize that every identity you adopt is temporary, useful, but incomplete. Carl Jung emphasized that the ego cannot fully represent the self, which means any fixed identity will always fall short of the totality of who you are. And once this becomes clear, something shifts. You stop trying to finalize yourself. You allow yourself to remain undefined in certain ways, not lost, but open. You are not constantly reinforcing who you are. You are allowing who you are to evolve. And this creates flexibility. You can change without feeling like you're losing yourself. You can grow without needing to stabilize every aspect of that growth. You can move through different phases without needing to define each one. This is what it means to live without a final version. You are not incomplete in a negative sense. You are incomplete in a living sense, ongoing, unfinished, but not lacking. Carl Jung believed that this openness is essential to individuation, because the moment you define yourself completely, you stop allowing new aspects of psyche to emerge. And this is where the deepest integration occurs, not in becoming something fixed, but in remaining available to change. You may begin to notice that this changes your pace. You move through life with less urgency, not because you are passive, but because you are not racing toward completion. You engage fully, but without the pressure to finish. You grow, but without the need to arrive. And this creates a kind of calm forward movement, not stagnant, not rushed, but steady. Carl Jung described this as living in alignment with the psyche's natural rhythm, not forcing development, but participating in it. And this participation has a very different feeling. You are not ahead of yourself. You are not chasing a future version. You are here, within the process as it unfolds. And from this place, something stabilizes that is deeper than any final state could offer. A relationship with yourself that does not depend on completion. A way of living that does not require a finish line. A form of awareness that remains open because it knows it will never be finished. And paradoxically, this is what allows you to feel at peace within growth. Not because it ends, but because you no longer need it to. At some point in your psychological development, a quiet realization begins to replace one of your oldest assumptions. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. You begin to see that the version of yourself you were trying to reach was never meant to be reached. Carl Jung understood this more clearly than most. He did not describe individuation as a path toward completion, but as a lifelong unfolding, one that continues as long as consciousness itself continues. And yet, for a long time, it may have felt different. You were moving towards something, a more stable self, a more aware self, a more integrated self. And that movement gave your growth structure, direction, meaning. But now, something has changed. You no longer feel that same pull toward a final version, not because you have stopped growing, but because you see more clearly what growth actually is. It is not a destination. It is not a finished state. It is not a version of you waiting to be achieved. It is a relationship with a psyche that never stops revealing itself. And once that becomes real, something releases inside you. You stop chasing yourself. You stop measuring how far you've come against an imagined endpoint. You stop asking when it will finally be enough. Carl Jung believed that this shift marks a deeper stage of individuation, not because you have reached something, but because you have stopped needing to. You are no longer trying to resolve yourself into something final. You are allowing yourself to remain in motion, and that motion begins to feel different, less urgent, less pressured, less defined by progress. You still grow. You still become aware. You still evolve, but you are no longer doing it to arrive. You are doing it because it is what it means to be conscious. And this changes how you experience everything. You face challenges without expecting them to disappear permanently. You encounter patterns without believing you should have eliminated them completely. You discover new aspects of yourself without feeling like you are starting over. Because you understand something now that changes the entire framework. There is no final layer. Carl Jung emphasized that the unconscious is inexhaustible, not as a metaphor, but as a fundamental truth of the psyche. There will always be more beneath what you see, more beneath what you understand, more beneath what you have already integrated. And instead of resisting that, you begin to accept it, not as a limitation, but as the nature of being alive. And this acceptance creates a kind of peace that is very different from the peace you once imagined. It is not the peace of having resolved everything. It is the peace of no longer needing to. You are no longer waiting for a moment where everything will settle permanently. You are no longer expecting a version of yourself that is complete. You are living within something that continues. And that continuity becomes stable. Before you leave, consider this honestly, not as a philosophical idea, but as something you can feel directly. Are you still moving through your life as if there's a final version of you to reach? Or have you begun to sense that what you are actually part of has no endpoint, That question is not meant to be answered quickly. It is meant to stay with you. Because the moment you stop trying to arrive, you begin to experience growth in a completely different way. Not as something you chase, but as something you participate in. If this shifted something in how you see your own path, share one moment where you realize that growth didn't end where you expected it to. Not as a conclusion, but as a turning point. Because someone else may still be holding on to the idea that they need to finish, when in reality, they are being invited into something far more expansive. And if you continue from here, continue differently, not toward a final version of yourself, but deeper into the process that has no final form. Because as Carl Jung revealed through his work, you are not here to complete yourself. You are here to remain conscious while you continue becoming.